We are talking The Piper. Now, there have been a few movies called The Piper. We are talking the 2023 movie that stars Charlotte Hope and Julian Sands. This was one of Julian Sands' final roles before he unfortunately passed away on a hiking accident. So, what is the story? Well, it's a horror story where the kind of boogeyman is the Pied Piper. It focuses on this woman, Charlotte's character, and she plays this member of an orchestra, and she is kind of working under Julian Sands' kind of conductor, and she kind of wants to ultimately kind of get ahead of the game. So she ends up stealing this concerto, this kind of piece of music from a Mendel that has passed away, to try and get in Julian Sands' character's kind of good book, so to speak. But this piece of music is actually a cursed piece of music and has magical influences, and was written by the Pied Piper all those years ago, and it seemed to have a kind of a supernatural influence on those around them, adults in one way, children in another. And ultimately, more people become infected with this kind of this musical curse. And what will happen? Well, you'll have to watch the movie and find out. This is the second movie I've reviewed this year that's actually about cursed music, interestingly enough. So, what's this movie like? What can I say that works in this movie's favour? It is a somewhat slickly produced film, and you know it's kind of fairly well put together on a kind of a technical level. This movie, I think, if you're a fan of classical music, maybe a slower pace than kind of your more contemporary kind of TikTok style influences and stuff like that, this movie has a slow and deliberate pace, and I think may suit people who enjoy the kind of the long symphonies and things like this. But it certainly has a kind of a certain ambience, a certain kind of like atmosphere. Obviously, music is a big part of this movie, and I think the kind of the classical music kind of soundtrack works well in creating and helping kind of create this narrative. And there's this particular cursed piece of music that you'll hear through the movie. And I've got to say, to coin a phrase from this movie, it ends up becoming a little bit of an earworm. So it's an interesting kind of feeling movie, atmospheric movie in many ways, which I thought, gives this movie some kind of, semblance of its own identity to a certain degree, which comes into contrast with something else I'm going to say in just a moment. But this kind of element of musical atmosphere, I think, does kind of benefit this film. The effects are a mixed bag, but I do like the kind of like the glowing eyes of the Pied Piper, as he's kind of certainly we see him a lot in the kind of the third act, and how these kind of glowing eyes start to come into people that have been affected by this kind of music. It gives it again this kind of ethereal kind of feel to it. And I quite like the effect. It's digital effect, but in that instance, I think it's done pretty well. And I gotta say, I think the Pied Piper as a character here does seem somewhat threatening. He is able to really influence people en masse, and with quite deadly results. So I think he generally comes across as somewhat of a dangerous kind of presence here. I think the acting in this movie is solid, if not spectacular. Julian Sands, again, a special mention to him as this kind of conductor who's somewhat kind of over the top, but I think it works with the kind of the character. He's not the main kind of character here by any stretch, but he gets a kind of a reasonable screen time, and he is the one driving our kind of main character, played by Charlotte Hope, to ultimately, take these somewhat unscrupulous means to that ultimately end up, causing all this kind of trouble. So, if you like a slow, deliberate pace with some kind of fairly well put together production value, with maybe the exception of some of the VFX. But I think the gothic imagery here, these houses and this kind of orchestra halls and things like that, give it some sort of like gothic feeling as well. You know, I think there are things to enjoy with this movie. What doesn't work in this movie, I've kind of alluded to it already, but this movie is a slower paced movie, and I will be honest with you, there are times here where it kind of borders on being a little dull. Now this is because of two things. The pacing is maybe a tad too slow, and ultimately the horror elements to it come relatively late. There is a little bit peppered through the movie, but it's quite subtle, and I think this movie would have benefited from having more of a overt horror presence through the movie rather than kind of saving it more for the kind of the final act of the film, because ultimately it's a woman running around, you know, first of all trying to get people to play this music and then getting people to try and stop playing this music. So, you know, it's not all that thrilling a kind of an engaging of a plot. The actual bare bones story as well is you know, it's a kind of very typical template horror film. It's a cursed object. Someone kind of, you know, ends up using a cursed object, and then they kind of need to stop it, but it's too late because people have, you know, already started using it, and then there's a kind of a revelation. So it's very much, I found, you know, outside of the surface level bells and whistles where we have the music play a big part, the actual nuts and bolts of the story, what happens to the characters, their motivations, what they do, you know, it's kind of stuff that you have seen before. So that, again, coupled with the kind of the not particularly engaging pace of the story, again, it kind of makes it somewhat kind of dull at times. Also, there's I found this movie to have some conveniences. Our main character's daughter happens to have a hearing disability. Oh, I wonder if that will affect the storyline later on and be consequential, you know, that sort of thing. So that was kind of handy, wasn't it? That she just happened to be, you know, not able to hear music when not having her hearing aid in and things like that. You see where that's going. So there's a few kind of conveniences and things like this in the movie. You know, the Pied Piper, I think, is an interesting. I mean, we get so many royalty-free kind of mockbuster type films these days that come out of these low-budget, you know, quickies like Winnie the Pooh. I mean, this one, arguably, the Pied Piper is again based on you know, classic literature and stuff, but it's a little bit of a higher production value. But even so, I still think sometimes the kind of the choice to use digital effects undercut a little bit of the kind of the movie's sort of scare factor. To be honest with you, we have our big gross scene, I suppose, is where the Pied Piper bursts through someone else's body, but it's achieved through digital effects, and it really doesn't look particularly kind of well done, if I'm honest. The movie is creepy, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily scary. And the kind of the, you know, the scenes that have horror elements of stuff you've seen before. You know, a ball rolling out of a dark room towards a child, and she tosses it back and it kind of rolls back. That old thing. Things like this. You know, a shadowy figure passing behind you. It's stuff we've seen before. It's very kind of generic in some ways, outside of its kind of musical kind of element to it. But the actual, as I say, the things that happen in the movie, the actual kind of plot is very typical. So overall, it ends up being somewhat of a generic movie. Certainly kind of watchable if it does sound like it's something you would be interested in. But I don't think it's going to kind of really stand the test of time, to be honest with you, and be somewhat forgotten, and ultimately becomes lackluster, but not a bad film. I'll give it a 5 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.